Okay, hello, nobody yet. Tonight is a special ranting session about build systems, requested by Pirate. It's going to be fun. Before I start, I'm going to send over on the chat. Well, let me start the whiteboard first. I send over on the chat the link to an old blog of mine, which is going to be relevant. It's a fairly old blog. It's from over 10 years ago, over 11 years ago, well. Um, but it will become clearly relevant soon, and it should give an idea of what's going to be, in general, the rant about. Build system. What are build systems? Build systems are tools, a set of different tools most of the time, that get strung together to go from source code to something that people can run. Usually that means you get from a bunch of source code. So let me, yeah. Oh, this one says my mouse pointer. Um, oh, and yes, I have changed the software I'm uploading this with. I'm using Streamlabs OBS this time. I had no idea how it's going to perform, but let's try this out. The main reason for the OBS was it has a chat visible. So if you have any questions, if you have any comments, if anything that I'm saying doesn't make any sense and you want me to repeat myself or explain it, please just leave a message on the chat. I should be able to see it. Okay, so where were we? Usually you have your source code. Let's focus for C. This is true for a bunch of other languages, not just C, but let's start simple. Let's say you have your hello world. And I'm going to not write all of it. You have your source code there. Did I zoom the wrong way? Yes, I zoomed the wrong way. Sorry, let me clear out the thing so I have space to actually draw this later. And as with last time, as I said, I'm using Microsoft Whiteboard, which is not the easiest one to use with the tablet because it still needs the mouse for half of the things. So you have your int main, you have your hello world, whatever it is, source code, and you want to transform this to an executable hello world. The obvious thing you need here is a compiler, because that's what you do, you compile this, which can be GCC, CLang, ICC. Is the Sun compiler still around? I don't think the Sun compiler is still around, but it might still be, I don't know. In addition to a compiler, you'll need a linker and a bunch of other tools that you don't care about because CC is a front end and by itself will take care of most of the work you need. But then you have other problems like, what if you need a library? What if this thing needs to be like CC hello .c -l save c -l, I don't know, RT. So the obvious thing for all of these is you use a makefile. Makefile has all the information you need, right? You can write a makefile. You say, this is my source file, this is my output file. Just run the compiler with these parameters and everything is fine, which is all right until you get to have to remember of dealing with dependencies, different compilers. How many compilers did I list? At least 3, right? What about the Microsoft Visual C compiler? What about the Portland compiler? There are tons of compilers. There were more compilers. There are fewer now because GCC and CLang seems to have taken over most of the things. Like the Sun compiler is probably gone. I have heard nothing of IBM's XLC in forever. Wacom still markets their compiler, but yeah, no, I had no idea what the state of it is of that one. So what you end up with most of the time, well, what you used to end up with most of the time back in 2009 when I wrote that blog post, which is a bit out of date, of course, is, and for those who are just joining, the blog post is on the chat room, and it is, I don't know, I'll put the link somewhere. Can I put the link somewhere? I can take a screenshot of title, and here it is. So this is the blog post that has the information about this. What you used to do is you used to have Autotools. Most people, like most open source projects, will have Autotools that will take configuration of some kind and will generate a makefile with the right parameters. So how? Well, let's zoom out a moment, have a little bit more space, and this way. What you will end up with is a configure.ac file which is upload it. This one better. This one better. The configure AC file, which is processed by autoconf with M4, and I'll try to explain what they are in a moment. And then you have the makefile .am. Terrible. Better. And makefile.am, but is processed by automake. And this then creates a configure file. And this creates a makefile.in, makefile.in, configure, and then the configure will take that thing and generate a makefile. And this thing will then rely on things like pkgconfig, and the tool. I don't know this. And a bunch of other things. To figure out like which compiler you're using, which operating system you're targeting, which libraries are available, which version of the C language you're using, which version of like which attributes are supported by the C compiler, and all that kind of features. That is complicated. It's messy. And as I was saying, autoconf requires M4. What is M4? Well, M4 is a different programming language. It's a macro programming language, with the idea being you get an expansion of macros to generate a different file. It's easier used than explained, I would say, but think of it as copy-paste as a programming language. Or alternatively, think of it as the C preprocessor, but used for things that are not C. It's stupidly complicated at times. And technically, it's not actually M4, but it is M4SH, pronounced MASH, which is an abstraction on top of M4 designed in particular to work with shell script, which is what configure is. It's a huge shell script. And it, by being a shell script, that encodes, like it hard codes a lot of information on that. For instance, running that on Windows without Windows Subsystem for Linux is hard. Not impossible, but it's hard. It also does a lot a lot of shell out to the compiler, to the tests, to check for the file. All of that stuff takes time on Windows because clone doesn't exist. A fork is actually more expensive on Windows than on Linux. There are plenty of reasons for that. The end result is the moment when Windows started becoming a more interesting target for all, yeah, this doesn't work. The main reason why I have quite a bit of knowledge around how this whole fits together or doesn't is because over time I ended up writing about it. So Autotools Mythbuster. Autotools Mythbuster. Oh, no, I think I cannot do this with the pen. I always forget. Is my own. No. Is my own documentation and tool and like how to actually use all of this together. And it is simpler than most people will think because it suffers from code memes. A lot of people are just copy pasting the configure that they found for from a project years and years and years ago. And a lot of them are using something that I really dislike, and that is nulib. Nulib, not to be confused with glib, or not to be confused with nulibc or glibc. Those are all different projects. Nulib is, well, let's get to that in a moment. I'm trying to keep this a bit focused, but I'm probably losing half of you on this one. So yeah. So because it's all complicated, eventually all of this got replaced by CMake, and people just decided, you know what, we'll just use CMake. And CMake is a completely different paradigm, but no, not completely different paradigm, right? It is CMake files .txt because it's designed to work on Windows. It has an extension by default. On Linux, you don't really care about the extensions, right? And that's processed by CMake to produce either a makefile, well, one or more makefiles, or a Visual Studio project for Windows builds. And CMake became very popular because of KDE, who started adopting it back in 2009, probably, I would want to say, 2007 maybe. I'm lost now on the timing. But the whole idea was, let's just avoid using all of the legacy of all of that. We'll just use CMake, and we'll still use pkgconfig because that's one way to do it. And it will still use, at times, other bunch of stuff. But sorry for the sirens. They're not coming here to arrest me, so that's okay. pkgconfig and a bunch of other stuff, like there are project config, foobar config, Python, Ruby, shells out to anything else that is needed there. And yeah, it generates makefiles as usual, or it can use Visual Studio to do all of this. Now, a lot of the answers about CMake were like, oh yeah, it's great because it's not autoconf. Mash is a mess, let me be clear, but Mash is not that much of a mess at all. So let's take an example of how does that look. Well, I have examples. I have what I call my basic Autotools, which is the Who's Afraid of Autotools. And let me take that. So this thing, or this is all you need. This is your most basic configure IC file. It says this is a new project, version 123. This is the person who's responsible for it. This is technically that's where to report bugs, which is handy, not quite useful at times, but handy. And this is the website of the project. I'm going to use Automake. No, the foreign part just means no, I'm not part of the GC of the GNU project. I'm not part of the FSF Blast projects, so I don't care about GNU specific entries of like news and files and formatting. Um, I don't care about the old legacy gzip encoding. I want the thing encoded in XZ, which is a more modern approach to compression. It's faster, it takes the space. I want a C compiler, and this is my make file. And the make file is just as easy. So, this is your make file, makefile.am. So I should probably put this next to the let me do it this way. I should eventually export this into a blog post or something like that. There you go. It's back here. Not quite readable. Add the size. There you go. No. There we go. Okay, I can move this one here and this one here. Yes. There you go. So that's your autoconf configure.ac, that's your makefile. And this includes a readme, which is completely optional, you don't need it. It just tells you like this is the minimum amount of work you need to get something to compile with Autotools. It's still not easy. It's 2 files to define all of these. I'm sure that it's just as easy and as straightforward in CMake, and it's a single file. You do need the CMake on the target system, but you want to build this on with Autotools. The idea was back in the days it will be harder to actually have a proper setup, and if you could just have a full setup, well, why would you need any of this anyway? And the idea is that when you create a distribution, like a tarball, an archive with all the files together put there, then it's going to be working, but like it'll just be all together, self-contained. You extract it, you run the .configure, you're done. But this is very old stuff. This requires Perl for Automake to execute it. It requires M4 to generate the configure file. Once you have the configure file, you don't need M4. Like it's only required to generate the configure file. So again, when you do a distribution, a full tarball of everything, you don't need any of that. What you end up with in that case is, oh, this still works. Let me draw it again. So if you have your tarball, you take all of these and you make a tarball. We call it tar, and that doesn't depend on anything. It doesn't need libtool. It will need pkgconfig maybe. If you use pkgconfig, you'll need it in from the system of the tarball as well, and it will need a compiler, so say GCC, and the linker and whatever else. But it doesn't have any of the dependencies on M4 and on Automake, on Autoconf, on libtool, on GNU. All of that is self-contained. For CMake, you need CMake on the system, which is annoying, but nowadays it's different. This is no longer the world of Unixes where You need to install core utils to have a CP that works correctly. You no longer technically need to check whether ln.-s works, which it won't on Windows, as it turns out. But you don't care about that most of the time anyway, because you wouldn't be using configure if you're building for Windows most of the time. Sometimes you would. All of that stuff is old. We're not in the 80s, we're not in the 90s, we're not even in the noughties anymore, we're in 2020. You can depend on something to run the build, which is why eventually even CMake was like, yeah, you just need to have CMake installed, you run this thing. The obvious thing nowadays seems to be Meson, which I don't know much of, but I had planned to experiment in 20 minutes if needed. Which again is like, you need to have this thing installed, even when on the system you go and build this stuff on. And that's fine, because nowadays, most people don't get this stuff out of a tarball. They get this stuff out of a Git repository on GitHub. And on the Git repository, you're not meant to submit the configure, the makefile.in, all the auxiliary files. You may not be allowed to, okay, not quite. You may end up with a bit of a mess with the licenses by distributing those on your Git repository as well as your tarball. It works because the license is such that you still can use all the GPL-based stuff in a Meet licensed program and stuff like that. It's okay, all of that will work, but it's still a pain in the neck. In particular, if you're using GNU, which you shouldn't be using, let's be honest, all of that stuff submitted to the same Git repo is just going to add noise to your history, you may forget something, and so on. The other problem with using the tarball with the files in it is that honestly, no distribution should ever trust the files are shipped from the tarball, and neither should the users. It's way easy to essentially inject code in a configure file in a way that it is nearly invisible to anybody. So yeah, in Gentoo, most of the time you end up rebuilding all the Autotools anyway, so you have them installed anyway. And the only reason why you wouldn't want to depend on having Autotools on the system is if you are bootstrapping, so things like Make or M4, that's going to be a funny one for later. Make or M4 cannot depend, no Make, on Autotools, because while you need those to build the Autotools or to run the Autotools, so you have a chicken and egg problem. And again, all of this is old school. What would I like to see? Well, what I would like to see is something that takes a more or less standard configuration of an Autotools project and translate it to something more modern. Generating a makefile is fine because Make already does all the dependency tracking. It really isn't the biggest deal. Like, you can use Ninja, you can use, which is a different workflow engine. You can even just run it directly, because except for very high parallelism situations, most small projects will be fine with building the single thread at a time. And I say that as having spent days of my life just going and working on most of this. Like fixing parallel builds, documenting how to fix parallel builds. All of that stuff is, in my opinion, wasted time nowadays for most small projects. Not for older projects, just for the small ones. So let's get some more space and see what I had in mind. Let me bring in a snapshot of the AutoConf of Unpaper, which is one of my projects, which uses Autotools, and it's slightly complicated, but not terribly so. What do we see on this thing? The important parts to note, and I will write them in red because it's the only color that is not here, or I'm kind of highlight actually in yellow. So we know the project name. The highlighter doesn't really do what I want, does it? Yeah, okay, this one better. We have a project name, we have a version, We have an issues URL. Honestly, okay, let's ignore that part. We have an actual address here. There was meant to be something there, and I honestly don't remember what it was. Maybe email address, mailing list. Mailing list should be. Uh, Again, a lot of this comes from this was designed to be used by the GNU project, and the GNU project, like every project at the time, had their own mailing list for all the development and all that kind of stuff. Nowadays, we don't really need any of it. More GNU project, like let's do this to be the GNU project, more GNU projects specialties. The foreign key, the foreign keyword pair. That color to use, I think. This color better. Yes. The foreign key here. The foreign just means I'm not going to have a news file. I'm not going to have a changelog because I already have it, so I don't need a changelog. The news might be there, might not. I don't need it there. I'm not going to follow whichever best practices GNU wants. Again, that's very specific to where project and way to run it. And the same is true for this choice, like this thing needs to do gzip and whatever. So those are not particularly interesting to us. We do care about the C99 version. The silent rules and the maintainer mode are make-file specific issues, and we don't really care about those. We do care about this one, which is looking for which library in the system provides the square root function, because it's not always libm. I think it's on Mac that it isn't there. If somebody remembers which operating system has square root in the C library, feel free to just say it in the chat. And then more interesting, it requires a tag. So over here it goes and asks for libv format, libv codec, libv deal. Math.h, that is that C library, the libc, or maybe it's one of the system libraries because of course it doesn't really have the C library the same way as everybody else, so who knows. The more interesting mess here is this, which is looking for XSLT proc, which is the generator for man pages, and yeah, that part is complicated and I'm not quite sure how to handle this. Essentially everything else is Autotools paraphernalia. The prereq, the 114, those are just ways to say I want at least this version of the tools. The silent rules is just like, just don't put the full command line when you build because I want to see actual warnings. Maintainer mode, it's an old automake mess. MKDRP, I think that was required by Automake at some point. The use system extensions, why is that even optional? It enables things like large file support, which it's irrelevant on 64-bit systems. It is relevant on 32-bit system. You really want it. There are some rare cases where you may not be able to do that, but let's just assume that you want them. And the same thing with the config and the output. Like, most of these is a few keywords that you can extract from it. This is the name of the project. This is the version of the project. This is a URL. You don't really care about the distributions. Honestly, I used to be a firm believer that the Autotools make this was one of the best things on earth. Of like just put everything in the tarball the way I want it. Yeah, it leads to so many problems because nobody runs this check. It's 2020. I'm not a fan of just packaging a Git repository up into a tarball, but you know what? That's what people are doing nowadays. It's okay. Let's move on with the word. Like, fighting that is not worth it. C99, I think it should be the baseline, honestly. Again, it's 2020. C11 is out. C18 is out. Although I think C18 is essentially the same as C11 except for a couple of fixes. So that's not important. The PKG check modules is important, like that's a dependency, that's what I'm asking. I depend on these 3 projects over here, make sure that they are there. It takes a while for the configure to fail if you're missing those 3 projects. And the output is not particularly useful for that either. There are lots of things in these configure.c files that are just pointless nowadays. And the problem is, most of those you don't actually get an easy way around them. There is Autoscan, and Autoscan is one of the worst tools that I've ever seen in my life, because it will go and say, oh yeah, you're including string.h. Let me make sure you have string.h on your system, because you may be trying to build this for a system that is 40 years old, but before string.h existed. I'm not saying that nobody ever builds tools for 30 years old computers. I think most of the YouTube retro gaming scene demonstrated that very well. But if they do, they usually know how to just go ahead and fix their string.h being missing. And if they don't, well, there you go. They learned something new, but they need to look into it. Or they will have to use tools that are more appropriate for the time of the computer rather than the time of the modern times. It can be extracted, but the Autoscan extracts it wrong. We could rewrite Autoscan to not do any of those things. We could have an auto upgrade that essentially goes, you're pulling all of those rules, they're completely useless, let's remove them. But you know what? Just have something that leaves this and run it somewhere else. Can we actually go ahead and use the same M4 tricks as configure, well, autoconfuse to generate the configure file to generate something better? Well, possibly. These are all just macros. What looks like a function call to most of you is just a macro. There is some text that is going to be replaced in with that particular parameter replaced, like put in. If you just go and take M4 and just say, all of these macros don't exist anymore, I'm going to remove them, it's going to print a smaller set of stuff. I haven't done this in a long while, but let's go ahead and try the obvious base things, right? So let's try that. Shout if you don't see Visual Studio Code in front of me right now. If you do, it's fine. You can also shout if you do, so that I know that it is working. And you can tell from here that I just installed Ninja. I actually, if you see it, good. And yes, I prepared this beforehand by making sure that I have all the Meson stuff installed, most of the Meson stuff installed. If I ever decide to, yeah, no worry, team, like there is not going to be much over here, and you can always rewatch it later. I'm mostly going to be ranting about this anyway. So if we do M4 on configure.ac as it is, just prints out everything again. If we do a new file and we call this, what was, I want the M for manual, please. So, and yes, I'm reopening the M for manual because I don't remember how to do this myself. Sorry again for the sirens. Defining the macros. So if we define, let's say, the C output, which we don't care about, to nothing. Oh, this is one of those that requires stupid inputs. Oh, sorry. I haven't done M4 in a while. Yeah, funny enough, I did next to M4, so that's actually worse. File, process macros, file, and where do I do? File, there is one that it gives me. I forgot how to give it the actual file with the definitions. Okay, we'll do it on the command line, it's easier. Anyway, as I was saying, you can define the function, the various, you can define the various macros, and then I forgot now how to do that on the actual file, because I haven't tested this before, to just do nothing. So things like am silent rules, there you go, it just goes away, because that's what M4 does. Like, it just goes, replace whatever the macro name is with the parameters with whatever you define it for. If you don't do anything about it, it will just delete it. And that's all you care about. You can extract with the same exact M4 method only the information you care for, like these two pieces over here, the M paper and the 6.2, which is the version, and the URLs, which URL you want, and you can generate something else different from it. And it's not any much different from the makefile. The makefile is slightly more complicated because makefile.am are actually parsed in Perl right now. There is a project called AutomakeNG, which is intended, well, it was intended to be a drop-in replacement for Automake in certain situations. The main thing being it required numake to be used instead of any make file, any make implementation whatsoever, which is rarely true because, yeah, standard Unix make is fairly limited. Most of the extensions you will use in this, like in a normal project, will be supported by BSD's pmake. But for the most part, people just use numake because that's what people tested with. Is a monoculture of make files, I would say. Also, honestly, it's 2020. Pmake is the only half-decent alternative I know of, and everything else is not even bothering trying to keep makefile compatibility, and they do well not to, I will say. So there you go. Anyway, for AutomakeNG, there is not been any progress whatsoever in 8 years. Automake 2.0 is, as far as I know, still not anywhere near being able to be used. Nobody really cares about that anymore. Most people have moved on. And yeah, this is the make file you get with. Parsing this is not obvious because like these are line continuations because these are actually proper like make file standard make syntax. As is this, because anything that Automake doesn't parse itself, it doesn't actually do anything with. Same thing for the test. And I don't think this one has no conditionals. But if you have conditionals, the conditionals are not parsable with the normal makefile parser. So you cannot use the conditionals with, like you cannot just go and say, yeah, this is just a normal makefile, just extract the stuff from it if there are conditionals. But if there are not conditionals, most of this is very simple. You have a binary that has sources, and the only cflex and ldflex are the dependencies, so you already know the dependencies should be there. You may have to specify them by project. And then you have a bunch of other things, like the test, the stuff to actually put in the tarball because you need it, which files to delete if you want to clean everything, which again it's a bit of an older thing. There is a man page generator. Are people still using man page? I assume so. There are better ways to write man page nowadays. Honestly, I will probably write this in Sphinx and RST because it's more likely that it's found than XSLT proc. But again, for the easy cases, like the hello world that I showed before, it's perfectly fine to just say, well, here's my source files, these are my dependencies, I don't care about anything else. And for all of those, we can do something about it. We can uplift with relatively simple M4 macros bad stuff to something more modern. As long as we don't do things like libtool yet, because that one is going to be more complicated, or GNU-lib. Like GNU-lib is not glib, is not glibc. Like both of those are different projects. GNU-lib is a, oh yeah, you're building. GNU-lib was started with, yeah, you're building on a new system. Here's a bunch of functions that are present in glibc, but not in your system that, in case they're missing, will provide. And then it's grown to, yeah, these are a bunch of functions that are not in glibc either, but very useful, so we'll provide them anyway. So now you have 20 copies of the MD5 functions because glibc didn't have them, but GNU-lib did. And you're like, why? Why? Why did you do that? Yeah, it hurts. I really hate GNU-lib. It also is one of the worst offenders when it comes to the time it takes to run the /configure, because it will go and check for all the dependencies of everything. So say you want to provide the MD5 function, I think it needs to check whether the memcopy works. Or some of the string processing functions where like, yeah, you want strl cpy, let me go and check 3 other different things, or you want strl loop, let me check if malloc works on your system. And you're like, it's 2020, don't, please. If I really need to support stuff that doesn't have any of those, I will go and tell you, but not by default. Yeah, that's the short version of that part of the rant. The other thing I wanted to try tonight was trying to see if I could get to use Meson for the build of Unpaper, because I heard very good things about Meson. I know that there are integrations to use FFmpeg, well, to build FFmpeg with Meson as well. So if you want to do a full build, you can do it with Meson. And I've also heard good things about it supporting Windows very well, which for Unpaper would be nice, because I get people asking for a build of Unpaper on Windows like every few months. It's a neat tool. It's written in C. It should be fairly easy. It only depends on FFmpeg, as you saw. And it builds fine with Clang, because all of this has been built with Clang before. But I'm not sure. And the reason why I'm not sure is because it relies on C99 heavily. And the way you are supposed to support C99, it says to set a default variable, but I haven't figured out why. So, well, let's try. Why not? I'm literally going to freestyle it now because, yeah, why not? I need to install Meson, so install Meson. As you can imagine, I don't use install user. There we go. Oh, that's interesting. I'm seeing that they actually have a section about distro packages for Meson, which is fairly handy. Yeah, so the other thing with Meson is, and that's to tie back with the blog post I linked earlier, Meson has knowledge of the system, but it can also discover dependencies, which is slightly different from what I've seen from other build systems, where they go straight into the, yeah, I know everything about this build system, and so I will know how to deal with everything. In 2009, I argued that discovering the environment is better than knowing the environment beforehand. The main reason being, if things change in the future, if you are hard coding the, oh yeah, GCC version 4.5 added support for this, so if it is after 4.5, it's fine, and then GCC decides to remove the feature, you're kind of stuck. Um, Nowadays, there are fewer things changing around us, and I would be tempted to say maybe knowing your environment is better than discovering the environment, in the sense of it is faster to make use of, and there are ways around the changes. Bazel, which is Google's open sourced and mostly unused build system, has this concept of tool chain settings where you can say, well, I'm going to use this version of GCC, these are the flags. If you have a binary, just build it with these flags in this way. If you have a library, just use this template to fill in the command line. I think all of those are great, are actually the right way to get around to most of the needed changes. Not with Bazel, because Bazel outside of Google is effectively unusable unless you are like a startup with, I know there is a service that you can subscribe to have your builds generated by it. For open source projects, I don't expect it to work anytime soon. I tried using it for glucometer utils to run the tests because it's also a test runner. It did not really work out well. What I really would like for the uplifting of the uplifting of the autoconf automatons on will be something fairly similar, like here's your toolchain configuration, just use this. Maybe even if it's compatible, who knows? Maybe it will be possible to leverage Bazel for all of that instead of going, here are your dependencies, like this is the binary with those dependencies, here's your CC binary build. Maybe I can do a stream, just me going and trying all the different build systems on paper and see how they all fare against each other. But probably that requires a little more preparation because like I know how to get around some of this, but not that much. But let's see. So I have the Meson manual open on the other window, which with the tutorial. I'm going to just post it in case somebody wants to follow at home. So I need to create a Meson.build file. Let's try. It will definitely fail at first because I don't care about search over that. So project on paper and it's written in C. Executable on paper, and is that a SQL file or let me see, reference table, reference table. Sources. Let's see. Can be strings, can be files, objects. Oh, all the remaining positional arguments. Okay, easy. Easy. Don't say that. It's not going to be. Let's copy all of this. So first impression, it's better than CMake. It clearly is Python E. I assume they either execute it as Python or pre-process it with a normal AST parser, because that's not uncommon. Could be Starlark, actually, now that I think of it. Because Bazel's Starlark is a subset of Python, non-Turing complete set of Python. And by the way, because I'm checking the time of the stream, as I promised I will land at 9. It's unlikely that this will get anywhere near working before that. But that's fine, Meson compile. It's not a Meson builder. Did I have to do something for that? Yes, I did. Meson builder. Builder. Okay. It failed because lots of deprecated stuff. Why did it fail? Yeah, package string is not defined, and that's the version of the build. Yeah, so one of the things I did not talk about earlier because I forgot that Unpaper even bothers using that is the C definitions of like package version, like package string, like this essentially just says Unpaper 6.2. So I'm going to just do Unpaper here. And I'm surprised that it actually seems to get much for, the port bags. There you go. It gets further than I expected it to go with Meson, with just 2 lines. I'm impressed. Paint me impressed. Paint me very impressed. Now, of course, this is for the simple cases. If you have something that does special stuff, version. And yes, if you ever wonder if it's a good idea to rely on your build system provided information from source code, the answer is no. Just don't. Please don't. There you go. It actually built the whole thing with a bunch of warnings. It fails to link because it doesn't know where to find libutil, but wow. How do you add dependency? Here's the thing. GTK that, dependencies, GTK that. Okay. Let's try. FFmpeg that, dependency, and then I wonder. So let me copy these 3 things here and check. Does it have multiple parameters or is single parameter dependency object returned by the dependency function? Oh, you can use the CMake find stuff to find things. Has some library specific fallback detection logic, but that scares me a little bit. But okay, dependency name. Okay, their documentation is better than Automix, that's for sure. Oh, there is a way to set the seed. Thank you. Thank you, Epiret, for the details. Ooh, I didn't see the C standard before. That's good, thank you. And let's upgrade it to C11 because the only reason why it's not using C11 is because Autoconf doesn't have a way to set C11. Oh, multiple dependency calls. I see. Okay. It is a bit more verbose than I expected, to be honest. It also seemed. Well, let's see now how it's going to behave. My impression of this is the wrapping around of dependencies in autoconf for the call over here. It means I need a FFmpeg, and these are the 3 packages or 4 packages or whatever number of packages I need, which has been abused at times. It also allows for overrides for the whole project, which is useful. Splitting this on a per single pkg config basis worries me a bit. But again, like the way it has been misused in autoconf is also kind of terrible, or more than kind of terrible. Okay, let's see what it does now. It's missing roundef. That's the math library. Let's see if there is something already. Error checking Meson library, find library, and required. There is a CC find library. But it doesn't seem to have. Okay. Yeah, I saw this one. But that sounds strange, because if it cannot find it because something else is broken, how does it know? Alright. I assume that this goes somewhere. Sirens. Sorry for the sirens. Sirens. Not silence. And I don't know the. Oh, I need to get the compiler. Okay, paint me impressed. This worked out significantly better than I expected. It works. Okay, this doesn't do the testing or anything, like I need to set up all of that, but it worked. It didn't take that long. It is a little bit verbose, but again, compare it with this, and I assume that you can use something like black to format it, because it doesn't quite parse as Python or Stylarc, but I'm sure you can use a formatter somewhere. Or you can write a formatter for that. You cannot write a formatter for configure.ac. Let's be clear on that part. You cannot write a formatter for this, because whitespace may be significant, you don't know. Because M4 is the way it is, it just replaces entries in the text. You'll see a bunch of things like this one, DNL, which means discard until new line. And you'll see it at the end of some macro call, just so that it knows to keep two macros together. And otherwise, it's going to generate invalid shell code. You cannot write a formatter, because you don't know what it's going to do with it. Yes, you can assume a bunch of things, but not really. Yeah, I like Meson. It looks like it's very sensible on all of this. Like, again, it's mostly a repository of knowledge rather than a discovery of dependency. Yeah, and yeah, bytespace in configure.ac is totally possibly meaningful. The other funny thing, you see this as if here. It's a wrapper around the if shell construct. That's essentially what there is, but it is defined that way, so that if you were to do an as if some parameter is set pkg check modules, and that will be the first entry of pkg check modules you hit, it will actually work all the times. If you don't use the as if, I think they may have fixed it in the more recent pkg M4, but it used to be that if you call pkg check modules conditionally the first time, it will emit the check for pkg config tool at the top of the thing, because not at the top of the configuration, but at the top of the conditional. And if that conditional is not executed, the next time you call pkg check modules, it will not have pkg config. And it will just go, I don't know what you're talking about. You have no pkg config installed. Which is just awful. That is just awful. I'm left without words by the fact that Meson managed to get me a working unpaper file. And yes, it is the new version, because I can see that the unpaper I put here. Wow. Wow. Yeah, this was fun. I can rant more about build system next time and get this thing back to work, or I can look into something different. If you have questions and requests, please ask more of them. I can look into libtool and explain that next time, just how it all fits together in the Autotools world. But I'm flabbergasted. I'm speechless. It worked. I'm happy. Okay, I need to check a few things, like did it actually use the file system extensions? Is it actually doing large files? I need a 32-bit build for that, because on 64-bit you wouldn't be able to tell. I will want to try and set that with Clang and a few other things. But overall, this is working, and I'm very impressed. So what do you think? Should I continue in 2 weeks and explore more? Yeah, I noticed that it's not Python. It looked like Python at first, and then I realized that the dependencies, and definition here is definitely not Python. Although Starlark does it anyway, it would have been nice to share that part. It's okay. I do see the point of not wanting the full Python interpreter, and I'm pretty sure that if they allowed, even if they just not decided to say it was Python, it's easy to make use of too many Python features without intending it. Yeah, folks, thank you for joining me in my rant. I'll rant more probably. This deserves a blog post because I'm thoroughly impressed. So I make sure to get Unpaper to work with this properly, to build and figure out how to run tests. I'm sure there is ways. I'll just write a separate test. Let's be honest, the test support of Automake is horrible, so I'm very happy to just use something different. And then I'll write a blog post about this. And again, I'm impressed. Thank you, folks. See you next time.